Hello, everyone. Welcome to Baker Tilly's webinar on emerging issues and trends influencing FMV rates among key opinion leaders. That's a bit of a mouthful of a title, but it is basically related to how we compensate our key opinion leaders that we contract with for certain services. So, as most of you in the audience know, we need to compensate those. Key opinion leaders at fair market value so as not to inadvertently violate things like the anti-kickback statute or any various anti-bribery and corruption laws around the world. Um, and so we, so all of us that really work in the FMV space wish doing so were sort of as easy as taking a cost buildup approach and doing a calculation based off of objective compensation data, adding a few adjustments in there to compensate for overtime or working on the weekends or doing the activity in the evenings. And in some cases, it is that easy and it is that straightforward. However, oftentimes, specific situations do come up that may require some additional considerations. This session is meant to address those types of situations and address how those situations may be addressed in order to, um, appropriately compensate our key opinion leaders while still staying within the boundaries of FMV. So that's really the purpose of this webinar. It is um, unfortunately, for if you joined hoping for like a 101 course on fair market value and what the definition of fair market value is, this one may not be for you, but this is, I think you would be considered a bit more of an advanced FMV course if we were in the syllabus of a university. So with that, we can get started, and we can start with some introductions of your presenters today. So myself and my colleague Sam Sutherland are here to walk you through our thoughts and considerations related to emerging issues of FMV. Again, I am Mark Scallon, a partner at Baker Tilly in its life sciences consulting practice, and I lead the compliance and ethics market offerings and service offerings for the life sciences industry at the firm. I've been doing this for about 25 years, really working with pharma, biotech, med device, and diagnostic companies in identifying compliance risk and putting some solutions in place to address that risk. We do that through a number of service offerings, with FMV being one of those. And I've been working in the FMV space and advising clients on fair market value for the last 15 years. And I've also served as an expert witness in a litigation matter that was directly related to compensation of key opinion leaders and whether or not it was done at fair market value. So that's my background. I'll turn it over to Sam to introduce herself as well.
Thanks, Mark. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Sam Sutherland. I'm a director with Mark's Compliance and Ethics team. I have over 12 years of experience providing various compliance and ethics related support to clients, and specifically lead our fair market values industry offering. So in terms of FMV, I have experience supporting clients that were under CIA addendums specific to their fair market value calculations and payments. So, helping to develop those FMV rates on a global scale, as well as developing policies, procedures, training courses for broader stakeholders in commercial medical, all that super fun stuff. And then I've also supported for FMV for bona fide service fee arrangements and preclinical research. My educational background is in finance and economics, and we bring, that experience as well as broader compliance-related experience to all of our FMV engagements.
Great, thank you, Sam. And let's take a look at the agenda now for what we want to talk to you about over the course of the next hour. So there are four main areas that we want to discuss, and we currently work with over 60 companies in helping them develop their FMV rates for how they compensate their key opinion leaders. And what we have been hearing, we've noticed a certain trend over the last year or so of issues that kind of keep coming up that is requiring us to say, okay, let's take a look at some specific situations that may need some additional consideration and how we're developing these FMV rates. And there's a number of issues that have been coming up across those clients that we sort of bucketed into four areas here. And so those are the 4 agenda items after our introductions here that we want to discuss with you. So one is around social media influencers and how are we compensating those that are on social media platforms and posting information about our products. That's one. There are also some country or regional specific challenges that have been coming up around availability of key opinion leaders and certain economic conditions of specific countries and regions that, again, has presented a challenge in developing FMV. Related to that, but also different, is specialty-driven challenges. So in terms of availability of certain specialties, subspecialties, ultra specialties, if you want to call them, that, again, gives us an opportunity to sort of take a look at how are we calculating FMV based on those conditions. And then lastly, as there always is, operational challenges, right? And so there are certain, as we work to operationalize FMV across the vast number of key opinion leaders we may be working with, it presents some operational challenges and opportunities to really streamline how we calculate and contract with our key opinion leaders. How we calculate the compensation and then contract with our key opinion leaders. So those are the areas we want to discuss today. Feel free to ask questions in the chat. And if we can, we will answer them as they occur. We may answer them at the end if there is time. But feel free to post those questions. If we are unable to get to them, we can follow up with you as well to make sure that those questions get answered. So going into social media influencers, there's a few things we want to discuss with you. One, we want to go into a little bit of what is driving the scrutiny around social media influencers and what is demanding more attention from us to ensure that we are compensating social media influencers at fair market value and appropriately. And then also talk a little bit about sort of the hourly versus intangible value nature of the calculation of our fair market value, considerations related to both, and thoughts that we have on how we could, or what are some of the inputs that need to kind of go into our thinking around developing FMV rates for social media influencers. So to get started, just again, to talk about sort of the external environment and what is driving the scrutiny, right? There are a few things. One is on March 3rd, the Department of Justice did release, again, some revised guidelines on an effective compliance program. The last time was in, I believe, June of 2020. But just a couple of weeks ago, they also released additional guidance. And the main changes to this release, one of them anyways, was related to the use of personal devices and also information that is posted on social media using those personal devices. Now, while that does not, and that guidance doesn't speak directly to the compensation of those individuals external to the organization that are posting, it's just one more thing that we're seeing that is creating, again, additional scrutiny and attention to the use of the social media platforms, which then leads to making sure that we are compensating anyone who is posting on the company's behalf is appropriate. The other is the OPDP warning letters, again, not speaking directly to the compensation of individuals that are posting on social media, but there were 3 OPDP warning letters last year that spoke directly to the use of social media in disseminating information related to companies' products. So again, it is leading to this sort of rising tide of scrutiny around compensation of social media influencers as well. And then lastly, recent media attention actually speaks directly to the compensation of those that are using social media platforms to either be an influencer and or promote or discuss and disseminate information related to companies' products. So just on Friday, I think it was in the New York Post, the headline on the upper right of this slide, patient influencers paid by big pharma to mislead followers. Considering the source and how true it might be, what really matters is that the perception here is that patients are being paid to promote big pharma, right? Which whether appropriate or not is usually never a positive headline to be seen on a publication. So again, these are the things that sort of driving the attention on social media influencers, and ultimately the compensation of those social media influencers. So, um, Sam, if you want to maybe go to the next slide and share thoughts and considerations and around how we would value or how we would compensate those individuals that are on social media.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. So I'm sure, many of the folks on the line have gone through contracting with HCPs, patients, whatever external expert consultant you're trying to engage with for social media activities, likely provided, the FMV hourly rate that's on your FMV grid, and the social media influencer said, no way. The reason being is that the FMV hourly rates, at least using a cost buildup approach like we use at Baker Tilly, are largely based on compensation data with additional adjustments for the type of consulting or speaker program efforts that the individual is providing on behalf of the manufacturer. When you're dealing with social media activities, the value is not always based on work effort. So, the value of the posting is not the 2 minutes it takes a social media influencer to copy and paste the information from the manufacturer into Facebook, Instagram, whatever platform, and press post. There's additional, intangible value that needs to be considered in that activity. So, talking about the labor-based work effort first. It's kind of an a la carte menu. These social media activities and services take different shapes and forms, where there may be pre-work work effort that social media influencer is providing, input on content development, communication with the manufacturer, going through edits after maybe it's reviewed by your promotional review committee or your medical legal review committee. That pre-work effort, any communications related to that, should all be based on that FMV hourly rate for that individual based on their qualifications, expertise, and consistent with your FMV rate grid for your consulting and speaker program activities. Additionally, any post-work effort. So, some manufacturers, after a HCP, non-HCP post information, they actually turn off the comments as a compliance control so that you don't have to monitor for adverse event reporting, product quality complaints. You don't even have to worry about it. However, if you leave the comments on for that posting, then the influencer who made the posting may engage with their community through comments and responses. General compliance controls, we would recommend that those responses be like a standard response matrix that is approved, again, by your internal committees as appropriate, based on the content of the message. And then, that post-work effort, just like any pre-work effort, should be based on that FMV hourly rate that's consistent with your rate grid. Here on the right, you see some intangible elements that are not going to be captured in that FMV hourly rate. So that would be any media usage. So we know a lot of the times, once that individual makes the posting for a set period of time, a year afterwards, the manufacturer can use that post. If there was a video included, a picture, whatever it may be, they do have usage rights to that. So there is, a separate FMV calculation for that. You also want to make sure that you take into account the intangible value of that individual's social media network and presence, and their robustness of their profile on whatever platform it is. These elements right are not considered in a standard FMV hourly rate that's on your rate grid for traditional consulting and speaker program activities. So you need to make sure you consider these elements as they appear in your compensation and FMV calculations for social media activities.
So, Sam, we actually have a question that has come up that is somewhat related because oftentimes the social media influencers may be patients, right? The question that has come up is, understanding that the focus today is on HCPs, do you have any experience or best practice regarding FMV for patients who are engaged to provide feedback or other services? And you can say other services could be the social media influencer, right? And I could start by answering Abe's question, which is the focus of today is on HCPs, but it is also on certain non-HCPs, right? So that would include patients, maybe patient support program executives, people like that, that wouldn't necessarily fall within the confines of the medical community or be defined as HCPs. So what we're talking about today, the scope of what we're talking about today, applies to HCPs and also certain non-HCPs, and that's why we're referring to them just kind of as key opinion leaders, which can go across the HCP and non-HCP spectrums. But Sam, what are your thoughts on best practices regarding FMV for patients?
Yeah, absolutely. So the National Health Council actually has guidance on patient FMV rates. I believe it's 50 to 105 US dollars. So we're talking US only in this example. Your patient FMV rate should be consistent with the rest of your FMV methodology. So where the kind of challenge with patients is identifying who these individuals are. So, they could be a warehouse stalker. They could be a CEO. Like, patients could be anyone. And when we talk about patients in this context, we are not talking about patient advocacy executives or celebrity patients. So take the Kardashians out of this example here. If it is a kind of run-of-the-mill patient, I would recommend using the National Health Council guidance of $50 to $105 per hour, and using the same approach that you use with your HCPs. So if you're doing a patient advisory board, you would take that same FMV hourly rate consistent with your other FMV methodology, multiplied by the number of hours that they provide the service, and then that would be your full FMV amount. We actually are going to be touching on patient advocacy executives separately in the presentation in a following slide. But in terms of engaging with like patient ambassadors or patient social media influencers, it really is the same methodology and approach. It's just that raw compensation data that you're utilizing as the basis of the calculation is what would be different.
Great. All right. Any other comments on social media influencers before we move on to country-driven challenges? Great. Okay. So before we go on to country-driven challenges, we have our first polling question. Again, there will be 4 polling questions throughout this webinar. But this first one here is, in your opinion, does compensating patient social media influencers carry more, the same, or less risk than compensating HCP influencers? So if it's more risk, hit A, same risk, B, less risk, C, or if this is not applicable to you, you can leave the webinar. Just kidding. We just hit D for not applicable. So again, in your opinion, does compensating patient social media influencers carry more, the same, or less risk than compensating members of the healthcare community that are also influencers? The results do take a few seconds to come up. And it looks like they are coming up right now. And we are still waiting for it to come up. So we're going to go on to the next topic. And when the results come up, we will circle back to that. But the next area is around country-driven challenges. So as I had said at the beginning, there are certain country-specific dynamics and or conditions that really requires us to take a look at how FMV is being calculated for certain specialties in those countries or regions. It can be related to certain supply and demand things, economic and health disparities, as well as global market or regional or country-specific market conditions related to their economy and inflationary based situations. So first talking about supply and demand, right? So, we asked a question here: what happens when the supply of HCPs does not meet the demand of patient volume or disease burden, right? So, in other words, as you are looking to engage with and contract with key opinion leaders in a particular country, depending on that country and or region, there may or may not be a large number of those HCPs in that geography. So one of the first thoughts or considerations, right, is that there is some robust data that is published from reliable sources that does report the HCP to patient ratio throughout the world, right? So by taking a look at that data that is available to us, it can be utilized to sort of identify what that median ratio is, and that taking a look then at that median ratio, if a certain country falls, HCP to patient ratio falls below that median, that could indicate a shortage or scarcity of available HCPs in that geography. The shortage or scarcity could be related to things like challenges in training, an exodus of HCPs from that particular country for political reasons or other reasons, or even just there just being a general lack of specialization in the area you're looking at, or in the area or therapeutic area that you work in the medical field of that geography. We bring up all of this supply and demand, right? Because where there is a shortage or scarcity, right, where it's below that median HCP to patient ratio, where there is this shortage of doctors existing in that geography, an additional FMV adjustment may be appropriate. So, as I said at the very beginning, right, we wish it was so easy to just do it, taking compensation survey data, calculating what the hourly rate is, making a few adjustments, and applying that across all regions and countries. In fact, best practice has said, from a compliance perspective, that it really should be a standardized approach across all of your regions and countries for which you are engaging with key opinion leaders. However, it's situations like this, supply and demand, and some of the other geography-based challenges on the next slide, that really says, in order for it to be truly fair market value, we need to start considering some geography-specific factors in developing FMV, and it can't necessarily be standardized across all regions. So that's sort of the supply and demand related challenge that we're dealing with geographically. Sam, why don't you take us to the next slide and talk about some of the economic and health disparities that creates additional FMV challenges to us.
Perfect. Thanks, Mark. So in addition to just, a scarcity of HCPs at a high level, there's additional in-country disparities that exist. So, rural versus urban access. When you're looking at, most of the physicians, especially top key opinion leaders in these types of developing nations that life sciences companies engage with, these are top, individuals in their field, and are typically located in, urban, central metro areas. When you also have a public, private, or hybrid healthcare model, a lot of the physicians that you might be engaging with are practicing in a private institution, not in a public institution. And this can cause some challenges with the FMV rates. The reason being is that there's a large disparity between the compensation data for HCPs in rural versus urban areas, or in public versus private sector within the same country. There's two ways that you can handle these types of disparities, and this is when you really need to ask the probing questions of whoever your FMV vendor is to understand the raw compensation data that's the basis of the calculation. So if the raw compensation data that is being utilized includes compensation data across the entire country and is not able to be filtered or can't be sliced and diced based on the criteria of geographic location, rural versus urban, or type of institution, public versus private, then you're going to be using national level FMV rates that include some of the lower paid compensation data for the rural and public sectors. If that is the case, then you may want to consider including an appropriate scarcity adjustment if the HCPs you're engaging with are located in those urban metro areas and practice within private institutions. If your FMV vendor does utilize compensation data that's able to be to isolate data points, rural versus urban, public versus private, then you can handle this actually through that raw compensation data. What I will tell you is, where we see these kinds of challenges is primarily in developing nations. And as you can imagine, the raw compensation data available is not as robust as we have in like Canada, the United States, and Western Europe. So in my experience, that the raw compensation data doesn't typically come in a format that you're able to isolate rural versus urban and public versus private. So, usually that kind of scarcity adjustment approach, if it matches those HCPs you're engaging with, is the only option to you. So something to think about there.
Sam, before you continue, I just wanted to share the results of the previous poll. So just as a reminder, the polling question was, in your opinion, does compensating patient social media influencers carry more, the same, or less risk than compensating HCP influencers? 51% of you thought there was more risk. 30% of you said that it was about the same risk. 14% said less risk, and not applicable was 5%. So interesting, right? So more than half of you felt that that there is more risk when compensating patients' social media influencers. And my thought on that is I sort of agree, just because just from a headline of the New York Times perspective, right, and perception wise, a headline that states that a patient is being paid as a social media influencer, I think has more of a perception of something shady going on, if you will, for lack of a better term. So there's the perception risk, right, associated with this, that I think does warrant there being a little bit more risk. Whereas if it was being done to someone who's a member of the healthcare community, people are, I think, more willing to forgive that or look past that because they're seen as more qualified, right? So that's just my thought on that. But all right, great. So going back again to country-driven challenges and economic and health disparities. Go back into it, Sam.
Perfect. Thanks, Mark. So one of my favorite topics, nerdy enough as that sounds, hyperinflation countries. So we get this question more often than probably any other question in our global fair market value engagements. Obviously, there are countries in Latin America, in Eastern Europe that experience a ridiculous level of inflation on an annual basis. We've given you some examples here with Venezuela and with Argentina. Turkey is another really good example too. Handling fair market value rates in these countries, traditionally, the two kind of operational proposals have always been, refreshing your FMV rates more frequently, maybe on a 3-month, 6-month basis, or anchoring to a more stable currency like the euro or US dollar. Refreshing the FMV rates more frequently. If anyone on the line that has to do with contracting with HCPs knows this is a heavy lift, a large work effort, and I don't think anyone really wants to be recontracting with HCPs every 3 months, every 6 months. Additionally, anchoring to a more stable currency like the US dollar or euro is a nice approach. It does help to remove some of the percentage of inflation increase. However, because of the exchange rate, it does not, remove all of the inflation increase percentage that you'll see. So it helps to solve some of the problem, essentially, but not all of it. So an interesting new approach that, you obviously would need to speak with your internal counsel about, that we've been discussing with some of our clients who, I am not an attorney, neither is Mark, just to say that disclaimer up front, but with some of our clients that are attorneys, is including in these hyperinflation countries terms in your contracts with HCPs that say, if inflation increases by Y percentage, then the FMV rates will be increased by X percentage. So the reason that, I think this is an interesting approach is because it kind of removes that need to recontract. And then I think this would solve, where anchoring solves some of the issue, this would address the full issue. Two things to comment here. Number one, wage inflation is not a one-for-one increase for inflation on goods and services. So, where Argentina has 95% inflation in 2022, you would not increase your FMV rates by 95%. So please, keep that in mind. It would not be a one-for-one increase. And then second, you would want to make sure that you include the source of inflation in your HCP contract, because I know no one wants to get into the situation where an HCP is saying, World Bank says inflation increased by this percentage. And then you as a company are looking at, as an example in the US, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it has like a slightly different percentage. So you just want to make sure that it's very explicitly stated in the contracts what source you would rely on for inflation in those countries.
Great. Okay, so that is some geographic challenges. We have now our second polling question. So based on the information and certain circumstances that Sam just kind of walked through, in your opinion, is a country-specific scarcity adjustment appropriate under those certain circumstances? In other words, are you buying what Sam just kind of walked you through and what her argument was there? Yes, it can be appropriate. No, it probably is never appropriate to have a country-specific scarcity adjustment in certain circumstances. C, if you're unsure, and D, not applicable. So if you could respond to the poll. As you're responding, and as we are waiting for the results of the poll, like we did in the first polling question, I think we're going to move forward with some of the content, and we'll circle back once we get those results. So the next area, so the third of the fourth areas that we want to talk about that presents certain challenges for calculating FMV is around specialties, right? So as I'm sure all of you that work in FMV have noticed that there are, depending on the level of specialty, rates can vary, right? So there are specific expertise or specialization related to a therapeutic area that could have higher and or lower hourly FMV rates. So ultra rare diseases, subspecializations, all of these other sort of specialized rates, if you will, that comes up all the time and comes up all the time with all of our clients. So there's that. There are specialties with frequent rate challenges that we see across all of our clients. And then there's also some non-traditional consultant type of situations that goes on related to specialties. So Sam, if you want to talk a little bit about some thoughts and or considerations related to these specialty driven challenges.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So when we're talking about specialty-driven, challenges or scarcity adjustments, so, we walked through kind of geography-driven scarcity. Now let's talk about specialty-driven scarcity. It could be a specific expertise or specialization where the number of individuals that have that unique qualification credential is extremely small. So my favorite example, one of my clients, we did an FMV rate development for rheumatologists that have biosimilars experience. Relying on our own research of the centers of excellence, and this example is specific to the US, within the US, and the number of individuals, we were able to drill down and realize that there were really only, 50 people in the entire US that had this experience. And then of that 50, how many were even willing to contract to do consulting services for a life sciences company. So in those sorts of ultra rare disease situations, A specialty-driven scarcity adjustment may be appropriate to consider in your FMV rate methodology. I think a comment to be made here, and this goes for anything we're discussing today. If you do, kind of consider these approaches to the FMV methodology, these need to be, documented, and part of your, supporting documentation for how you calculate your FMV rate. So, all of this must be well documented and formalized. Additionally, we know that there are frequent rate challenges with certain specialties. So I know with neurology and pediatrics, we see these are our frequent pain points for our clients. And speaking in the US, where we have a large salary differential between physician specialties, these are some of the lowest paid. And that's because we have a very unique healthcare model in the US where it's primarily driven by reimbursement, so that physicians who frequently perform procedures are compensated higher than individuals who do not. And that's why, one of the main drivers of why you see neurologists and pediatrics as some of the lower paid physician specialties. Do I agree with this as a mom, as having a baby who sees a pediatrician? No, but that's a whole different, discussion. That is just what the compensation data shows us objectively. So when you're dealing with these individuals that are, for example, neurologists and pediatrics, you want to make sure that you're assigning the correct raw compensation data to these individuals. So as an example, a general neurologist, makes slightly less compensation than a neurologist that specializes in movement disorders or specializes in pain management. So when you're looking at these types of specialty-driven challenges, you definitely want to make sure that you're correctly identifying the background and qualifications of the individuals that you're engaging with. Especially, here in the US, there's a lot of subspecialization that we see, and you want to make sure that you are assigning the correct raw compensation data to these individuals. Additionally, talking about the patient advocacy executives that were mentioned earlier in the presentation. So, frequent questions about non-HCP consultants, your patient advocacy executives, your reimbursement specialists. So, we do have raw compensation data for these individuals, for nonprofit executives, for patient advocacy executives, for, managed care directors, managed care managers. So we actually have all the raw compensation data, and the FMV calculation and methodology is consistent with your physician and HCP calculation methodology. The one thing that you need to note is different is the tiering criteria. So here at Baker Tilly, we employ a cost build-up approach based on objective compensation data, and we provide our FMV rates in 3 expertise tiers in ranges. So those 3 tiers, very standard. If you've dealt with FMV before, it's local thought leader tier 3, regional thought leader tier 2, and then your top national, international thought leaders are your tier 1 individuals. In order to appropriately tier these non-HCPs, you need to have a separate set of tiering criteria, because if you're trying to apply the tiering criteria for physicians that have, clinical trials are embedded in the criteria, and publication activities, these are not relevant to these individuals' roles. So what will happen is you're constantly going to be getting tier 3 for all your non-HCPs. So if you take anything away from this discussion topic, is that the actual FMV rate calculation methodology is consistent with your physicians and HCPs. It's your tiering criteria that you need to make sure appropriately reflects the backgrounds of these individuals and the activities that they would be involved with in their field.
Great. And we have the results of the last poll. So if we want to go back to that real quick, if you recall, the second polling question was, in your opinion, is a country-specific scarcity adjustment appropriate in certain circumstances, with certain circumstances being those things that Sam walked us through. And the results are 63% say yes, that those country-specific scarcity adjustments under those certain circumstances could be appropriate. 8% said no, so very low there, with 22% being unsure, which I totally get, and then 7% not applicable, right? So again, 63% agreeing that in certain circumstances, a country-specific scarcity adjustment could be appropriate. So great.
I think we're actually going to our next polling question now, Mark.
We are. So with that, our third polling question, again, related to the specialty sort of adjustment that Sam was just talking about. So with this polling question, in your opinion, if a geographic related scarcity adjustment, so one of those adjustments we were just talking about in that last polling question, right? If a geographic related scarcity adjustment has already been applied, could it ever be appropriate to apply an additional specialization adjustment on a per specialty basis? In other words, I realize that might be a little confusing. Can we do two adjustments? Can we do a geography adjustment because of certain, can we do a scarcity adjustment based on the geographic challenges associated with a certain country? And then on top of that, also do a specialization adjustment if there is for that same specialty because of the conditions that Sam just walked through related to specialization challenges. So in other words, can two adjustments ever be appropriate, or would that be inappropriate? So hit A if yes, you think that it could be appropriate. B if no, it would never be appropriate to have both a geographic scarcity adjustment and an additional specialization adjustment. C if you're not sure, and D not applicable. As you are answering those polling questions, we actually have a question that just came in, which I think we have enough time to respond to because we have just one more area we want to go through. But the question is, do you also, so this is related to Sam's previous comments around tiering that she was just making. And the question is, do you also tier patients and patient influencers? So do those key opinion leaders, if you will, are they subject to tiering as well?
That's a great question, Mark. So no, we don't. We have the same, range for patient FMV for all tiers. So there are no expert patients. A patient, in our view, is a patient. So no, there is no tiering for patients. And I say that as patients, meaning your patient ambassadors, your patient advisory board members, patient advocacy executives. Yes, we do have tiering criteria for those individuals, and it's largely driven by the number of years of employment in their field or in their role.
Great. We actually have the results of polling question number 3 now. So again, in your opinion, if a geographic related scarcity adjustment has already been applied, could it ever be appropriate to apply an additional specialization adjustment on a per specialty basis? Very similar to the results of polling question number 2. The yeses are 64%, the noes are 8%, not sure is 23%, and not applicable is 5%. So
interesting.
So interesting. So those who feel that one adjustment is warranted also feel there could be a situation where two adjustments could be warranted. So great. Okay, so going into our last area of challenges that we wanted to discuss with you today has to do with operational challenges, right? And there are two areas related to operational challenges we want to talk about. One is around bucketing, right? Because there are certain regions, areas, countries where bucketing may be bucketing specialties and or countries together may be more in line with, may be more customary in those particular countries or regions. And then also the practice of setting operational rates is a consideration when it comes to the operational challenges across multiple regions. So Sam, if you want to take us into that topic, that'd be great.
Perfect. Thanks, Mark. So anyone who's I think worked probably, in FMV on a global scale is familiar with the concept of potentially bucketing or grouping specialties and or countries together. We do see this a lot. So where, I think Mark's use of the word customary is a nice term for this. So I think it is very much customary in my experience in ex-US and ex-Canada countries to group either specialties or countries together where appropriate. And I'm going to kind of explain some considerations there that you need to think about when you're doing this. So number one, in the US and Canada, I usually always see FMV on a per specialty basis. I think, that's largely driven, again, I am not an attorney, by the regulatory enforcement actions in the US and Canada being, a little bit higher of an action environment than the rest of the world. When you're talking about grouping or bucketing in those ex-US, ex-Canada countries, there's a few considerations. So number one, in Western Europe, when you're talking about like the big 5 EU countries, I usually do not see those grouped on a country basis, but I do see grouping of specialties frequently in Western Europe. So what that means is grouping specialties that have similar compensation data, similar educational backgrounds, qualifications, specialties together where appropriate. What this means, usually there's kind of a standard like 6 buckets that I see. So, highly specialized physicians. So that would be your surgeons, your cardiologists, those that are making, the top amount in comparison to all other physician specialties. Usually see a specialized bucket. So that's your oncologist, your urologist, nephrologist, those that have a specialization, have like a higher compensation data than general practitioners, but they're not on that orthopedic surgeon, invasive cardiologist level. The third bucket would be your general practitioners. So those are your pediatricians, your hospitalists, internal medicine, family medicine, general practitioner physicians. Then the other buckets would be for your allied healthcare professionals. So depending on what types of individuals you're engaging, you could have one allied healthcare professional bucket, or if you are engaging with, nurse practitioners that are specialized in addition to, a sonogram technician, then you might have multiple allied healthcare buckets because, and this goes into kind of the considerations for grouping, the raw compensation data and the FMV rates that are based on that data are very different comparing a sonogram technician to a specialized nurse practitioner. So, grouping of specialties is definitely something that we see a lot. And then alternatively, grouping of countries. So usually in developing regions, so grouping of countries is typical for me to see this in certain Africa countries, Latin America, Asia Pacific, and Eastern Europe. When you are grouping specialties or countries, there's some really important things to consider. So number one, grouping of countries, you want to make sure that you're looking at countries that have similar healthcare models, similar, economic indicators like GDP and PP and purchasing power. World Bank data has a lot of really nice, robust information on that. So you can use that as a good resource to identify if certain countries are similar enough to group. And then when you are grouping either specialties or countries, obviously you have to review the FMV rates on a per specialty or per country basis to make sure that your groupings are appropriate. You can't have a super high FMV rate included in a group that's pulling everyone up. That is not compliant or appropriate. So just be sure, if you do go the bucketing or grouping route, that you're grouping like specialties, comparable specialties, or like countries together. And then lastly, setting operational rates. So this is always a really fun discussion. So we do provide, our FMV rates in ranges. So from there, our manufacturer clients would set an operational rate as a single data point to, disseminate to the broader organization, to your commercial, medical, R&D stakeholders. There's a few different ways you can do this. Our general recommendation for years has been to look at setting the operational rate at the 65th percentile within the tiers range. So the reason the 65th percentiles kind of developed is because it gives you, a nice amount of wiggle room if your HCPs are trying to negotiate up, so that if they do, you do have to go to a higher amount to engage with a top thought leader, you're still not going above the FMV maximum for that tier. However, there's other considerations. So if you have an existing, FMV operational rate card, and you don't want to, you're doing a FMV refresh, and maybe you've switched FMV vendors and it's a different methodology, you don't want to have a new rate card go out to the broader organization that has some increases that are 20%, some increases that are 2%, and get a whole bunch of questions. So we do have clients that will actually take their previous operational FMV rate when we're doing a refresh project, and will apply a set percentage increase, and then just verify that whatever the new operational FMV rates are, that they do fall within the FMV ranges that were provided by Baker Tilly. So that is another approach to setting the operational rate, as opposed to kind of basing it off of the FMV rate range provided by your vendor. And then the last comment I'll make is compensating all HCPs at the same event at the same FMV rate. So I'm sure many of the folks here on the line know that our consultants and external experts talk to each other. They're at the same advisory event. There's how much did you get paid for this? This is what I got. And that can create, some disruption when they start naturally and organically discussing that. So what you can do to combat this, first, if all of the HCPs have similar, backgrounds, it's the same specialty, and it's all, tier 1 or tier 2 individuals. You could compensate either, if you wanted to take a very conservative approach, all of the HCPs at the lowest FMV rate. Also, another approach, if you're less risk-averse organization, would be to compensate everyone at the tier 1 FMV rate and document those FMV rate exceptions that you made for your tier 2 thought leaders. And, there should be an FMV rate exceptions form. And in terms of FMV rate exceptions, our general guidance to, manufacturers is that you don't have more than 5% of your overall HCP engagements on an annual basis having an FMV rate exception. So that's another approach if you are, a less risk-averse organization. The last comment I'll make before we get to our last polling question and closing remarks is, if you have an advisory board with individuals of varying levels of experience, so you have some physicians, some non-physicians, unless you're going to be taking a conservative approach of compensating the physicians at the lower non-physician FMV rate, I would recommend not compensating those HCPs at the same amount, because the physician, FMV rates are so much higher than the non-physician, like nurse practitioner, physician assistant FMV rates. I think, not that this is a fun exercise, but I have had to do it myself for some of our clients, is if your non-physician mid-level practitioners find out the amount the physicians are getting compensated and are upset about it, it is a exercise in explaining, either through email or phone call, and I've had to do both, the regulations that drive why, the life sciences industry has to pay FMV, how FMV is based on actual compensation data. And typically after that very, very delicate explanation, in my experience, every, non-physician I've had to have that type of interaction with has understood why they were paid an amount that was less than a physician. So I think that's all about, communication and socialization.
Great. So if we want to go to our last polling question, does your organization utilize a grouping methodology for specialties and or countries in certain regions? So is the grouping methodology that Sam walked you through, is that something that you're already doing at your organization? So A for yes, B for no, C not sure, or D not applicable. And as we wait for people to respond, we do have a few minutes here. About a bunch of questions did come in towards the tail end there of this last topic. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but I think we can answer a few. And then for those folks that we did not get a chance to answer your question, again, please feel free to reach out to us with those questions, and we can answer them on a one-off. But just to address a couple of them here in the remaining minutes that we have. One is, do you see FMV rates as fixed values or a max rate not to be able to be exceeded? Sometimes an HCP would ask for a little less than we would offer, which is probably rare. But and Sam, I'll answer, and then you can elaborate if need be. But it is not a fixed value, but each individual tier, the top number at each tier would be a max rate, right? Unless there was some sort of an exception involved. It is perfectly fine to pay less, right? So let's say, tier one for a particular specialty maxes out at $350 an hour, right? You can certainly pay them $250 an hour if you want. You can even set that as the operational rate. And then, based on negotiation, you can then, you have some wiggle room, but I would not exceed $350 unless an exception is warranted. So any other thoughts on that, Sam, or did?
No, you're good. Yeah, I like to say FMV is a ceiling, not a floor. So if you're able to engage with an HCP for an amount below the tier low, that's great. They believe in your company and they want to partner with you and believe in your product. And, I think that's great.
Great. And then another question is, how do PhDs, and actually there were a few questions related to how do you treat PhDs and how are they treated differently? So how do PhDs fit into this discussion? Do companies include them as HCPs? Where do they stand relative to HCPs? Is it lower base FMV, et cetera? So thoughts on how you handle PhDs?
Great question. So usually, almost all of our clients have PhDs included in their standard, HCP, non-HCP FMV rate card. The amount, the FMV rate for a PhD, in my experience, is, the compensation data is very similar to a general practitioner. I do say, keep in mind if you're dealing with like a top scholar, top global expert, that might be someone who falls into that 5% FMV rate exception rule. But as a general rule, they're similar to a general practitioner physician FMV rate. And because PhDs are frequently publishing and doing activities that are similar to physicians, the tiering criteria that they would fall under would be the physician tiering criteria.
Great. And the results of the last polling question are in just as time is expiring. So does your organization utilize a grouping methodology for specialties and or countries in certain regions? 42% said yes, 18% no, 16% not sure, and 24% not applicable. Interesting.
Maybe US only.
Yeah, maybe US, maybe US only. Exactly. So great. If you want to pull up our contact information for those, if you can't read that, my email address is mark.scallon@bakertilly.com, and Sam's is samantha.sutherland@bakertilly.com. If we were unable to get to your question, apologies, but feel free to shoot us a note with those questions and we can respond to you via email, or happy to also jump on a call to discuss it. And if anyone has any other questions that you did not post here and would like to talk to us about FMV, any challenges you're dealing with, our thoughts on how you can address your challenges, again, we're also happy to jump on a call to discuss that. Again, thank you everybody for joining us. We are now a minute over, but hopefully this was informative. Hopefully this addressed some of the things that you were dealing with, or has maybe created more problems than you thought you had already. But at least now, hopefully you have some direction and or considerations for how to deal with it. And again, feel free to just give us a call or send us an email to discuss anything that you are dealing with in your organizations. So thanks again for joining. It was a pleasure. Hope to talk to you again soon. Take care. Bye.